So first, thanks for the introduction, Jeremy. Thanks for having me. I did a brief introduction in the beginning. I'm just going to talk a bit about what I'm doing in my work and my PhD as well. So I'm over at business school. However, I've had long experience in conservation as well. I'm originally from Indonesia. So I came over here and took a PhD. And so this research that I'm doing, presenting right now, is the part of the chapter of my PhD, the first chapter. And how it started was basically, because I've been delving a lot looking at news seizures and understanding what's going on in the wildlife trade. I was interested whether we can extract the data and use it for analysis, a kind of a more in-depth analysis. And we've been also looking a bit more and looking at available data online and how can we use data that's available online to do some conservation-based analysis. So for this work, I use news-reported seizures to characterize the wild bird trade. My supervisor over there is Cleva Wilson. He's a professor of environmental economics, and I've also worked with Duan Biggs. He's also my co-supervisor, and Rachel, who's also joining in the participants. She was the co-author for this work. Okay, so a bit about the Indonesia's wild bird trade, or just wild bird trade in general. Like every other developing country, there's lots of exploitation of wildlife going on, and in Indonesia, birds specifically have very important value in the culture. Why? It's because it's so embedded, and there's actually a saying that a man, to be a complete man, it would have to have 5 things. The first thing is a wife, a house, a vehicle, a dagger or a weapon, and finally a bird. So it's so embedded in the tradition in the past. It's such a status symbol what birds are. And as it goes on, as time progresses, it kind of develops more, it becomes a hobby. And with internet and social media and Facebook community, Indonesia is such a collective society as well. It just keeps on growing and growing. And the birds are mostly taken from the wild, so they're heavily exploited. However, with all this information going on, we have market surveys in cities and such. We don't really have a comprehensive understanding of what's going on throughout the whole country of Indonesia. And I'm trying to explore a way, can we look at it at a domestic level, and can we understand what's going on in the trade in the domestic level? So can we also understand patterns to highlight what taxa is most concerned and which regions should give most conservation concern as well? So before going into what's going on locally and before going on to birds, I need to know what's going on, what is available publicly online, because I'm over here taking my PhD over in Brisbane. I don't want to go from province to province to get data from NGOs or from governments, because often data, when it comes to local trade information, it's scattered all over the country. It's a waste of time, a waste of effort. So can I get it all centralized? Ideally, we're looking at trades such as the big iconic species, the elephants, the tigers, the rhinos, the pangolins. You'd have databases for that. You have centralized, globalized databases, but it's often on those large iconic species that most of the research is going on. And also, lots of the studies that are happening are focused on global scale, transnational level trade. What if the trade, local trade, is actually suspected to be larger than the global trade? And this happens not only with birds in Indonesia, but it's noted to know from birds from Brazil and probably some in China, countries in Southeast Asia. So how do we get that information? Because a lot of the databases, such as CITES, which is used often, they would give you information on country-based, and they also have limited information for local and also lesser interest species, lesser known species. They have complete ones for the big iconic ones. The thing with CITES is a lot of the information that comes from CITES are dependent on, the reporting quality is dependent on the rate of how good the signatory countries report to them. So you have really good reporting ones, for example, maybe Europe's good in reporting what's going in and out, but you've got countries like Indonesia that has a lot of information, a lot of seizures that are happening. They are not getting reported and uploaded in the CITES database. So the ones that do get reported are also limited. And the scale, again, it is national country based. How about the local level? If we want to know more about that, that is not available. And then the second one for CITES is there is a time lag duration between when it is actually submitted for report and when we can get it for downloadable for analysis. And then that time lag makes the information not up to date. If I need data on seizures per March and April, it might not be available on that database. Of course, you've got other databases that we can look at. You've got the health map that is based on news reported seizures as well. However, the health map is still highly based on English sources. Health map is actually quite good because when it comes from, it's the sources for our zoonoses and for invasions for health concern. I haven't explored it with that, but there's limitation, again, not going into local scale when it comes to trade. There's another portal that was recently launched. It was launched after I published this paper, actually. It's by Traffic. So Traffic would have, they have staff all over the world that are recording confiscation seizures from all over the world. So they do have local level to local level data. However, for this portal, you still have to have access, you still have to have permission. There's limited download ability for you. And they actually held a seminar, I think last month, and they said only 50% at the moment is loaded here. So it's still limited in capacity. So then I'm looking for a source that, one, has up-to-date information, two, is focused on several species, and especially species of least concern that doesn't come up a lot. They're not iconic ones. Three, they're publicly or openly available. And four, most importantly, they contain domestic level root. And although I'm using birds as a case study here, I'm also curious if I were to use my subject for something else like reptiles or small mammals, would this particular source be the same? I mean, like, it can be as effective. And ideally it would, because it really depends on what seizures are reported by the countries. And because lots of news now is going online, for Indonesia, I've been going through and looking a lot of the seizures and looking that news reports are really up to date. Sometimes if it's seized today, they have the seizure news the same day. There are some sources that are like that. It's not the best quality. The best quality is if you wait a couple of days after. But what's great is, so this is in Bahasa, so don't worry about that. I'll point to the important parts of the information. But what's great about it is, as I go through and look at these seizures, I would get information on the volume. It almost always has the volume of birds there. It has information on where the birds come from, and it also has the information where it's headed for. And sometimes it even has information if it comes from more than one location. So it has details on the routes. If we're lucky, we get those. I'm not using this for my research, but it also has information on how it's smuggled, if it's of interest, using what, through land, through sea or such. But also for me, most importantly, it has information on what species were seized, where, and how many individuals often. And then you have all of the important ingredients of making that you need to identify and map the trade work of the wildlife trade of a taxa or a species. So then we have this media which has potential to look at and understand, if we analyze well, some information of the trade network of birds. So then I took them and I tried to understand, can we identify pattern within the trade network, such as identify taxa high conservation priority, and can we also identify trade network hotspots? Where should we focus our conservation efforts on? For my PhD, this helped me determine what to focus on. So before going in the field, I can have open source data to know what is of high concern and what should be of high interest. So then how we do it, first, I myself already had a pool of data, and how I got that pool of data is really simple. I did try like news databases like Factiva, Reuters News, but those weren't effective because they're highly English based. So I just went on to all plain Google, and Google apparently is great because, one, I have to note that do not use news.google.com. Do not use that because it has this all confusing and busy interface that's just useless. So go to google.com, and then you type your keyword of interest. After you type your keyword of interest, what I did is I clicked on the news tab. What this gives, and this doesn't just work for confiscation news, you can use wildlife conflict news or whatever news of interest. You click on that, and then you go on the tools, you click on the tools so you can change the date range. That way you can specify when you want to get your information from. And then after that, you have to, of course, test the keywords iteratively to make sure that you get all options and all the news is covered. And for me, these are the most prominent keywords, the most that I use the most. And one tip is also include the stakeholders or the agency or a government, whatever is mostly involved in a particular incident. In this case, we're doing seizure incidents, so the ones that are most involved are the enforcement, the police, and then the Natural Resources Agency. And that actually gives a lot, because what happens is they would mention which agency or which authority is involved in that particular incident or the news. So then once you've got your pool of data, then what I did is I extracted the data. Like I mentioned before, you'd have volume, origin, destination, method, species, and such. So then all of this took it out and then just kind of put them in an Excel file. So then it's neatly extracted. However, then there's an additional step that needs to be done, is we have to notice that not all media reported seizures are created equally, because not all have complete information and not all have the same. So you have to make sure that we have a standardized method on how to extract them and make sure that they're treated the same way for analysis itself. In my case, how I did that is the next step would be how to deal with incomplete data. Incomplete data, basically in my case, there were two, because I wanted to build a network, was one, location, and the second one was incomplete species data. So incomplete location is because I'm doing a trade network and a hotspot analysis. I would have three basic locations, which is origin, transit, or seizure, or whatever. And then the third one is the destination. Sometimes those are not always there. So for example, we're doing a trade route that takes birds from, let's say it goes from Sydney, it gets to Adelaide, and then it goes to Perth. And however, it gets seized in Adelaide throughout the journey. In news reports in those cases, they might say, this bird was seized in Adelaide and was destined for Perth. So they didn't have information on the origin. So in this case, if it didn't have information on the origin, what I did was I used the seizure location for its origin location. This has limitations, of course, but then, and then we'll see also in the data, but then that's like, at the moment, we're trying to work with what we have. And this is also another important reason why I was thinking of using text extraction methods, but I opted not to, and I recommend not to, because then you understand the contents of your news report, of your seizure. If you do text extraction or text analytics, you don't understand the context. Really difficult to understand when, for example, there are missing locations. The same with destination. If there's no destination, then the seizure location becomes the destination location. But then when there's no origin nor this destination, they only have seizure location, then it will not be included in the network or hotspot analysis. It will, however, be included to just measure how many birds are seized in that particular area. And then step 3, when you're dealing with incomplete species data, this gets a bit trickier. So I wanted to look at my trade routes because there was so many birds. I basically only focused on 3 orders: songbirds, parrots and cockatoos, and everything other order would go in a different group. So for species, if species not available, then I would group it to the nearest taxa available. Ideally, I want them all to be grouped in a particular order. If they are also, if data on species not available and it cannot be classified to the order level, it just says birds, then this will not be included in the network analysis. It will still be included to measure volume, but not for a network. So the network, so there'll be like this huge sample population of ones that is used for measuring volume, and then you've got a smaller population inside and just looking at the trade information based on what we can extract from the media reported seizures. So in the cases, that's for if it's not up until its taxa. It gets more complicated when sometimes you have cases like this. You'd have a volume of 223 birds. However, over there, you've got species. Over here, it says manyar, reo-reo, perling, nuri kecil Sulawesi. So those are the species. So you have the volume, but they're not telling us the proportion of that volume for each species, which makes it tricky because then you've got pseudoforms, you got parrots and cockatoos here, and then you also have songbirds. So in that case, if they're from the same order and also only consist of 2 species, if they're the same order, then I just instantly group them in their order. If they're from a different order and only contain 2 species, they're from 2 different orders, and then I can just divide them into 2. Or they're only mentioning, 2 families or stuff, anything that's just consisting of 2. But if it's the condition just before, there are actually 2 orders or more, and more than 2 species as well, then I would not include it in the network analysis. So the reason of omitting it is simple, that it's just too much variation. I don't want to assume anything. I want to make sure that it is clear and it can be measurable, it can be comparable. And then for a bit of housekeeping, we make sure that all species that we identify has IUCN status, protection status, family, population trends, and so on. And then finally, we want to identify hotspot regions. So for this one, this is where it gets a bit complicated and tricky. Maybe some of you have used social network analysis and familiar with the method, but this is what we basically use. We apply the social network analysis to understand the degree of connection, how well connected one region is with another, with the assumption that an area that has more connections, and a connection is a single identified transportation route in a seizure. So the more connections they have, then that means there'll be a more important hotspot. So in this case, what we do is we are measuring connections for each region. And here it's ABCD. Let's say it's ABCD provinces. How many outgoing connections and how many incoming connections does each region have? We can see over here D, for example. D has 2 connections that are outgoing and 1 connections that are incoming. Then they'll have 2 outgoing connections and 1 incoming connection. The outgoing connection, the measurement in social network analysis is called the centrality measurement, and the outgoing connections are called out degree, and the incoming connections are called in degree. So then for every single province identified, we would measure those number of connections. And finally, what's measured is also a transit connection. So a transit connection would be if a certain region or province would connect one province to another. How many times do they connect, and how much connection is established based on that particular region becoming as a transit connection? And that measurement of centrality is called the betweenness centrality. So those are number connections. In addition to that, what's important to include is also the volume that is transported in a shipment in every single connection, because you can have 2 provinces with the same number of connections, let's say 5 and 5. However, if one transport 1,000 and the other transport 100, that is obviously the role would be different. So then I measured how many volumes were being transported out and transported in for every single region. All of these values were normalized, because if they weren't, they would be too high of a variation it'll be too high, and it will be difficult to deal with the numbers. And normalizing them helps it, makes it easier to compare. So then for the hotspot, for the sync hotspot, or all of how many birds are coming as a final destination area. So you would join how many connections incoming plus how many volume of species that are also entering that particular region, or in this case, province. And then you reduce sync on the destination and not as a transit location. And same as source, how many is going out and how many is the volume going out, and then minus the betweenness, and then finally, as a transit location, would have its own value. So a hotspot value is how strong a particular region is as a sink, as a source, and as a transit. All of these, again, are normalized. All right, so it is quite a long method on how to do it, but because it's just varying, the news that we get varies per source, but everything, we have to make sure that they're all normalized and have the same structure prior to analysis. So the results, what did we get? So this is Indonesia, and then we found that the provinces with the most seizure, the highest seizure, were over here near Sumatra and Lampung, 48,000 birds from 2010 to 2019, and the second highest was Banten for 34,000. You've got East Java as a third, and then you've got the other provinces as well. Riau surprisingly was high, and I'll explain why. And then finally West Kalimantan. So these are how many were seized in the country. And then we've got a total of 321 incidents. And we found within 10 years, 132,945 birds, which might seem a lot, but do note when it comes to seizure and wildlife trade analysis, it's really opportunistic. So this is most likely more has actually passed than has been seized. A study has actually predicted around 600 million birds per year. So, and that was a study in 2012. I'm pretty much sure it has increased. 157 species, and also work on market surveys have found around more than 200 species in the span of at least 3 days in a single survey. So we know this in 10 years, this is a very small proportion of what's going on. 83%, 84 actually, if you go close to round it up, percent of those were songbirds, very, very big. The biggest seizure that I recorded was 6,000 songbirds in a single seizure from Lampung going on to Java. 4.4% were parrots and cockatoos, mostly from eastern Indonesia and entering into Java. Other orders consisted of 0.9% and 9.9% were unidentified. So they only mentioned birds were seized. I suspected songbirds, but again, they didn't have details on it, so I didn't group them. And it also shows limitations of using media reported seizures. I plotted a species accumulation curve, and I found that species are predicted to increase with increased seizure reports incidence. So it's still going up, nowhere near flattening. If it's flattening, of course, we predict that the species are decreasing. And over here, the x-axis is the x-axis is the number of seizures recorded, and the y-axis is the number of species recorded within a seizure. So as more seizures are recorded, it's most likely to keep on increasing. So that's just an overview of that. And the species that we found, most of the species of the 84% of songbirds consisted in the top 5 families. And all of these top 5 families are those mostly used in songbird competition. From the family Muscispidae, a lot of that was oriental magpie robins and white-rumped shamas, which is prized for songbird competitions. Which is of high concern is the greater green leaf bird, because they are not only protected through Indonesia's law, but also this is the bird that in 5 years has gone from not least concern to near threatened and now vulnerable. The populations are declining rapidly. Another concern is also sunbirds. This is a small amount of sunbirds. Sunbirds are gaining interest in the community because they're considered cute and unique and different to own a sunbird. So sunbirds are getting also smuggled in the hundreds, even the thousands. So this is a small proportion of what's actually going on out there. Parrots usually are traded as pets, and they go through eastern Indonesia. And for parrots, it's been a long story, extending story in Indonesia that it's endangered species, it's protected, but many people still want them as pets. And for other orders, the first one over here, doves. Doves are commonly used in competitions as well, a different type of competitions. But of interest is over here, eagles, pheasants, casuaries, I don't know, and hornbills. So pheasants, casuaries are hornbill. I'm guessing they're pets. I haven't gotten much literature on that. It's definitely something interesting to look more into. But eagles, definitely increasing trend. Well, not definitely, really highly suspected increasing trend due to presence of online communities, online eagle keepers. And when I was in the field, I heard people are breeding them. They're creating competition, flying competitions. They call themselves falcon groups and such. So as usual, social media is making these conditions kind of worse. So we've got the species, and now we're looking at the hotspots. So all of that calculation of centrality measurements and also hotspot measurements, what does it come out as? We know first, for one, that Jakarta is the most important hotspot region, and it makes sense as the capital. It is the most important destination region. As you see, the source value, hotspot value is 0, so rarely anything comes from Jakarta. But you can see that the sync value is very high, 0.97, and the between us value is 1. So because everything's normalized, 1 indicates the highest out of all the regions that were identified. Between us is 1, that means Jakarta is not the last destination. Jakarta serves more as a transit area than it does as a sink or a source area. So what is the main sink? What is the main destination? 5 out of the top 6 hotspot areas are Java, inside Java. And then the main one is West Java as a sink area. And then the rest also have very high values for sink. Banten has a high value for source as well, relatively. But this is mainly because it's a transit into Java. Again, this still shows, again, the limitations of media reported seizures with incomplete information. But again, highly recommend reading through, doing manual still extraction one by one, because then you would understand where the limitation lies and why it's there. Usually what happens is it's from Lampung and it goes into Jakarta over there through Banten. So you can see Lampung is 48,000 Cs, Banten is 34,000 Cs. So it's most likely more of a transit than a source, but that information wasn't available from media reported seizures. Lampung is a source, however, like Banten, Lampung is most likely a transit as well, because lots of the birds that go into Java actually come from Sumatra, and you can see there's other provinces above Lampung that usually takes birds and then they transport it as Lampung as a transit area. And you can see that these are the other provinces a bit north, South Sumatra, Riau, and Jambi, and they also have high source value. Maluku has a high source value as well, and this is mainly for parrots and cockatoos. Now, this is a trend that I identified from these seizures. Malaysia apparently has a very high source value, and they're most likely enter into Indonesia through West Kalimantan and Rio Island. So outside of identifying the value, I would map the trade route, which I will show after this, and why I would suspect these two, not only because it's a high value as sink, and when I say sink, it's because, again, limitations from the news reports that only stop saying that it's destined or seized in that location. But what is of interest, actually, what goes through Malaysia and gets smuggled in Malaysia, other species that are highly declining in Sumatra. These are the highly sought out songbird competition birds, and it's known to, there's not much, you can't hear them anymore, even in Sumatra. So then the poachers go beyond Indonesia and try neighboring countries. And it's not just Malaysia. I've got the top 20 here, but there have been records for Vietnam. There have been records taking it from Thailand as well. And then another trend is also emerging from the lesser Sundas, which are usually not touched. And they are going from West Nusa Tenggara over to Bali, either feeding Bali or predictively could also feed Java. So I was talking about mapping to understand more how the route goes. So what this looks like is actually, these are clusters, and all this is when they're clustered, they have shorter routes, and most likely that's the group where the transportations are most happening compared to the ones that are different clusters. So we haven't actually published the code for this, but I'm happy to share code. I use R, and I'm happy to share and show like how do you extract Excel files to make a graph like this if it's of interest to do something other than birds in Indonesia. So you can obviously see the bigger the circle, the more important the regions are. It's very distinct that you've got 2 points here, East Java and Jakarta, in 2 different clusters. Lampung, Banten, Jambi, which were in the regions of concern, and then also top 6 regions of in Java are here in 1 single clusters. And you can see the thickness of the lines indicate volume. You can see how distinctly different the volumes are for birds coming from Lampung to Banten and entering Jakarta. So when we were talking about Malaysia just now and how Malaysia is predicting through West Kalimantan and through Rio Islands, as you can see, there's a thick line going West Kalimantan, and from West Kalimantan, you've got a small arrow here in Jakarta, Malaysia going into Rio Island, but we don't have much information whether it's going into other places, Sumatra or not. Based on people I talk with, most likely it is, but we don't have that information explicitly stated from the news reported seizures. So again, in the nature of wildlife trade, even though this line is really thin, it doesn't mean that it doesn't occur. It just means that it only has been very few seizures recorded from there. We don't know how many has passed through without being seized. So this is a description. It doesn't mean, it's a description of what's happening, but in reality, it's almost difficult to really get a precise picture of it. I was talking about West Nusa Tenggara, and then East Nusa Tenggara here is Lesser Sundas, the island regions. And you can go from here to Bali, and then there's also a route over into East Java. So that's possible. I was mentioning Thailand and Vietnam as well, and you can see Thailand's actually quite big a circle, so those have been recorded. And I'm not gonna go much more into detail about this because it is, you can see it's very messy. So very messy is not a good thing, obviously, because these are the ones identified. We're not even talking about the ones that we don't know, the ones that we're getting routes. Like if we go on the ground and we talk to informants, we can also plot it out. So many things that can be plotted out, but from news report seizures itself, it's already this complicated, showing the many, not only the many routes, but the many sources of birds that they're trying to get into Java, which is very, very concerning. And then outside of songbirds, we've got parrots and cockatoos and also other orders. And although the lines are not as thick, you can see it's still very complicated. The other orders might be a bit less complicated. As you can see, the partitioning's a bit nicer, the arrow's a bit nicer to see. The parrots and cockatoos is still quite all over the place, but it's very distinct, the clusters. You've got a cluster over here that looks at Eastern Indonesia. It even has the Philippines. Inside the Philippines has been known as a smuggling route as well, some going straight to Jakarta. You've got Sulawesi, you've got Lesser Sundas and such. You've got lots of routes entering East Java, and then you've got ones that are entering Jakarta. Again, Jakarta and the East Java are important regions. And then finally, you've got a cluster over here that's quite distinct over in the western part of Indonesia, which is quite of concern considering that parrots and cockatoos don't really occur much in this particular cluster. And then other orders, again, similar patterns, East Java, Jakarta is the main. And then you've got countries, also Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore and such. So I'm not going to go into details, just going to lay out that you can map it out and also look at areas of concern and also highlighting and how complicated Indonesia's wild bird trade is. Okay, so to conclude everything, basically I started out on looking at media reported seizures and wondering whether I can understand the extent of the trade and also patterns in the trade routes and such. And I found that they could potentially provide data which is publicly available. It's open source, it's up to date. You can analyze species up to domestic level. You have to note though, if you want to look at that, you have to understand the local language. Local language sometimes provide more information than English-based sources. And these are for Indonesia's case, so we're looking at domestic level trade. A lot of them is complete because we know the local language and what's going on there. However, it is very important to note that these news report has to be used in caution. You have to note, of course, how to make sure it's standardized. You have to know like how, because quality varies from source to source as well. And then if you can get more than one source, that's great. So you can confirm that the news that is reported is correct, the number of birds are correct, the destinations and such information there is correct. And again, I can't emphasize this enough, do manual extraction to understand what is going on in the route and to understand where the lack of information or the missing informations are. And then finally, for Indonesia in particular, what this research has shown is, of course, the scale of the trade, which is enormous, and that's just a small percentage of it. But mostly it has shown new routes. It has opened up international smuggling is happening. It has emphasized and shown that international, transnational based collaboration is definitely important, because if the birds start to decrease in Malaysia or that Vietnam, wherever they're smuggling, there's a high possibility that they can expand beyond that just to search for the bird of high demand. And this is just from news, again, just from news reported seizures. I've been reading articles on selling birds from all over the world that goes into the country. They just, yeah, it's, we don't know how much, if we're not curbing this soon, we don't know how much it can affect not only Indonesia's but also globally. It can affect, the demand can affect it significantly. So then we need collaborative efforts and conservation efforts, both domestically and internationally. I think that is all. Thank you.